The 61-year receipt most Americans believe their country saved. Britain during World War II out of shared democratic values and the goodness of Allied friendship. Most Britons believe something similar, that Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt forged a special relationship built on mutual sacrifice against fascism. Both versions make for a comforting story, and both versions are incomplete. The truth sits buried in treasury records, diplomatic cables, and loan documents that tell a very different tale. A tale where one ally systematically extracted the wealth of another while that ally was fighting for its survival. In the winter of 2006, 61 years after Victory in Europe Day, the British government made a wire transfer of $83 million to Washington. This was the 50th and final installment on a post-war loan, and with that payment, Britain officially closed the books on World War II. The transaction received little attention in either country. A small story in the financial pages, a brief statement from the Treasury, and then silence. But consider what that payment represented: a debt that outlasted the Cold War, a debt that survived the collapse of the Soviet Union, the reunification of Germany, and the birth of the European Union, a debt that 3 generations of British citizens paid through their taxes, year after year, decade after decade, to the wealthiest nation on earth. The question nobody seemed to ask was simple. Why did Britain owe America anything at all? Standard answer points to Lend-Lease, the program through which America supplied weapons, food, and equipment to Britain during the war. Roosevelt called it lending a garden hose to a neighbor whose house was on fire. You would not charge your neighbor for the hose, he said. You would simply ask for it back when the fire was out. That metaphor was brilliant politics and a complete misrepresentation of reality. Britain did not borrow a garden hose. Britain was stripped of virtually everything it owned, was forced to sell its most valuable overseas assets, compelled to hand over military bases on terms that would last a century, and ultimately left so financially broken that it needed additional loans just to feed its population after the war ended. The British Empire that existed in 1939 was the largest the world had ever seen. It encompassed territories on every continent, investments in industries across the globe, and financial reserves that made London the center of international commerce. The British Empire that existed in 1945 was a hollow shell, indebted beyond anything its leaders had imagined possible. Stripped of the economic foundations that had sustained its global position for over a century, this transformation did not happen because Germany won the war. Germany lost. It happened because of the terms Britain accepted from its closest ally in exchange for the supplies needed to keep fighting. And those terms were not accidents of wartime chaos. They were calculated, negotiated with precision, and designed to achieve exactly the outcome they produced. What follows is the story of how that extraction worked, who benefited from it, and why the pattern it established continues to shape international relations to this day. The first drain, when war broke out in September 1939, the United States declared itself neutral. Congress had passed a series of neutrality acts throughout the 1930s, specifically designed to keep America out of European conflicts. The memory of World War I still haunted American politics, and the public had little appetite for another foreign entanglement. But neutrality did not mean America would refuse to do business. The Neutrality Acts contained a provision that would prove devastating for Britain. It was called cash and carry, and the terms were exactly what the name suggested. Any nation at war could purchase American weapons, ammunition, steel, oil, and industrial equipment, but only under 2 strict conditions. They had to pay in cash, meaning gold or US dollars, up front before anything shipped. And they had to transport the goods on their own vessels. Payment had to be immediate, in full and in gold or dollars, before a single bullet left American shores. For Britain, this presented an impossible situation. The war against Germany required a constant flow of American industrial output. British factories alone could not produce enough aircraft, tanks, ammunition, and equipment to match German manufacturing capacity. The steel mills of Pittsburgh and the assembly lines of Detroit were essential to British survival. So Britain paid throughout late 1939 and into 1940. The British Treasury hemorrhaged gold and dollars at an alarming rate. Every shipment of aircraft engines, every delivery of machine tools, every cargo of petroleum products required immediate payment. The money flowed in one direction only, from London to New York. From the Bank of England to American manufacturers and the U.S. Treasury. Then came June 1940, and the situation turned catastrophic. France collapsed under the German advance, and Britain stood alone against Nazi-occupied Europe. The possibility of a German invasion became real. Churchill's government faced a terrifying choice. If Germany crossed the English Channel and conquered Britain, all the gold and foreign securities held in London would fall into Hitler's hands. The Nazis would capture the wealth of the British Empire in a single stroke. The response was Operation Fish, one of the most extraordinary and secretive undertakings of the entire war, beginning in late June 1940. The British government loaded its entire gold reserves onto warships and converted passenger liners. These vessels then sailed across the North Atlantic, through waters infested with German submarines, carrying the accumulated wealth of centuries to Canada in the United States. The scale of this transfer was staggering. Over the following months, more than $2.5 billion in gold bullion and negotiable securities made the crossing. Battleships carried crates of gold bars, converted ocean liners, transported boxes stuffed with stock certificates and bonds, representing British ownership of companies around the world. The Bank of Canada's vaults in Ottawa filled with British treasure. It was the largest physical movement of wealth in recorded history, and it happened in almost complete secrecy. By November 1940, the gold was gone. Britain had transferred its entire reserve across the Atlantic to pay American bills and keep it safe from German capture. But the war was only 14 months old, and it would continue for nearly 5 more years. The British Treasury informed officials in Washington that there were simply no more dollars available. The cash had run out, but the need for American supplies had not diminished by a single shell or a single gallon of fuel. Britain was now fighting a world war with empty pockets, and America held all the leverage in whatever negotiations would follow. Morgenthau's audit, with Britain's gold reserves depleted. Winston Churchill wrote to President Roosevelt in December 1940 with a stark admission. The British Treasury could no longer pay cash for American supplies. The money was simply gone. Roosevelt wanted to help, but he faced domestic obstacles. Isolationist members of Congress opposed any policy that might drag America into war. Any assistance program would need to convince skeptical lawmakers that Britain had truly exhausted its own resources. This is where Henry Morgenthau Jr. entered the picture. As Secretary of the Treasury, Morgenthau would lead the American side of negotiations. His approach was not sentimental. Before the United States would consider providing assistance, Morgenthau demanded proof that Britain had nothing left. What followed was an extraordinary intrusion into the financial affairs of a sovereign nation. Morgenthau requested a complete audit of the British Empire, demanding detailed records of every asset owned by the British government and private British citizens anywhere in the world. The British negotiating team found these demands stunning. German bombers were striking London almost every night during these discussions. British civilians were dying in the Blitz, while American officials insisted on examining imperial financial records before committing to any support. Morgenthau remained unmoved. His position was straightforward. If British subjects still owned valuable assets in the United States, why should American taxpayers subsidize the British war effort? Britain would liquidate those assets first, and only then would discussions about aid begin. The first major sacrifice Morgenthau demanded was the American Viscose Corporation. This company was the largest manufacturer of rayon in the United States, owned by British firm Courtaulds. American Viscose generated roughly $10 million in annual dividends flowing back to London, and independent assessments valued it at well over $100 million. Morgenthau delivered an ultimatum. Britain would sell American Viscose immediately, or the Lend-Lease legislation would fail in Congress. In March 1941, the British government seized American Viscose under emergency wartime powers. The sale was handled by American investment banks led by Morgan Stanley and Dillon Read. These bankers understood that Britain had no bargaining position whatsoever. They purchased the company for approximately $54 million, roughly half its actual worth. The dollars went directly to the United States Treasury, while Britain paid Courtaulds in pounds sterling, adding to the country's mounting internal debt. American Viscose was only the beginning. Over the following months, Britain was compelled to sell more than $650 million worth of securities and stocks that British citizens held in American companies. Investment portfolios built over generations were liquidated at whatever price American buyers chose to offer. By mid-1941, Britain had sold off approximately $1.1 billion in American investments, equivalent to more than $20 billion today. Only after this comprehensive liquidation was complete did Lend-Lease funding actually begin to flow. 50 destroyers for an empire while Morgenthau focused on financial assets. Another extraction was happening in parallel. This one involved territory rather than money, and its effects would last for nearly a century. In the summer of 1940, German submarines were devastating British shipping in the Atlantic. Merchant vessels carrying food and supplies were being sunk faster than Britain could replace them. Churchill desperately needed destroyers to protect these convoys, and he asked Roosevelt for help. Roosevelt agreed to provide 50 American destroyers. These were old vessels from World War I, many of them sitting in mothballs and barely seaworthy. The United States Navy considered them obsolete and had little use for them. But Britain was in no position to negotiate over quality. The price for these aging ships was remarkable. In exchange for 50 destroyers that America did not want, Britain granted the United States 99-year leases on military bases across the Western Hemisphere. The locations included Newfoundland, Bermuda, the Bahamas, Jamaica, St. Lucia, Trinidad, Antigua, and British Guiana. These were not minor installations. They represented strategic control over the entire Atlantic approach to the Americas and the Caribbean basin. American military planners had wanted access to these locations for decades. Now they received that access on terms that would extend until 2039, all for a collection of rust-prone warships that required extensive repairs before they could even be deployed. The bases agreement was signed in September 1940, months before Lend-Lease even existed. It demonstrated what Britain would be willing to sacrifice when survival itself was at stake. And it established American military presence across a vast swath of territory that had previously been under British control. The arsenal of democracy and its hidden claws on March 11, 1941. President Roosevelt signed the Lend-Lease Act into law. He presented it to the American public as a program of generous assistance, a way for the United States to support Britain without sending American soldiers to fight. The imagery was reassuring. America would provide the tools, Britain would finish the job, and everyone would settle up fairly when the crisis passed. The actual legislation told a different story. Lend-Lease authorized $31 billion in aid to Britain over the course of the war, an enormous sum that undoubtedly kept Britain fighting. But buried within the agreement was Article 7, a provision that would reshape the global economic order in America's favor. Article 7 required Britain to work toward eliminating discriminatory treatment in international commerce after the war ended. This language sounded benign, almost idealistic. In practice, it targeted the economic system that held the British Empire together. That system was called imperial preference. Under these arrangements, British goods received favorable tariff treatment throughout the empire. Products manufactured in Birmingham faced lower duties in Canada, Australia, India, and dozens of other territories than competing products from the United States. This network of preferential trade relationships protected British industry from American competition and kept imperial markets oriented toward London. After the war, British markets across the globe would have to open fully to American exports. The tariff walls that protected British manufacturers would come down, and American companies would compete on equal terms throughout territories that had previously been closed to them. Churchill's government understood exactly what signing this provision meant. But with German bombers overhead and the future of Britain itself uncertain, there was no realistic alternative. The document was signed, and the clock began ticking on British imperial commerce. The silent takeover while Britain poured every resource into the war effort. A quieter transformation was taking place across global markets. British factories converted entirely to military production, manufacturing Spitfires, tanks, and ammunition around the clock. This meant that civilian exports essentially stopped. British companies abandoned commercial relationships they had maintained for generations in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. American companies filled the vacuum. While Britain made weapons, American manufacturers supplied the world with automobiles, refrigerators, radios, cultural machinery, and industrial equipment. Markets that had purchased British goods for decades now turned to American suppliers. And these new commercial relationships would prove permanent. The numbers reflected this shift dramatically. American GDP grew by 75% during the war years. U.S. exports expanded into regions where British commerce had previously dominated. American brands established themselves in territories that had once looked to London for manufactured goods. The financial transfer was equally striking. By 1944, the United States held approximately two-thirds of the world's gold reserves. The vaults at Fort Knox swelled with bullion that had crossed the Atlantic from London and other Allied capitals. The dollar was rapidly replacing the pound sterling as the currency that mattered most in international trade. Britain was not merely borrowing from America during these years, it was watching its commercial future migrate permanently across the ocean. The empire's economic foundations were being transferred to new ownership, while British attention remained fixed on the battlefield. Victory over Germany would eventually come. But the global economic position that Britain had built over 2 centuries would not survive the process of achieving it. The lifeline severed on August 15, 1945, Japan announced its surrender and World War II came to an end. Celebrations erupted across Britain, with crowds gathering outside Buckingham Palace to mark the victory that had cost so much. 6 years of sacrifice, bombing, rationing, and loss were finally over. 6 days later, President Harry Truman signed an executive order terminating Lend-Lease immediately. There was no transition period, no gradual wind-down, and no consideration for the ships already crossing the Atlantic, loaded with supplies. Vessels in mid-ocean received orders to turn around and return to American ports. The abruptness of this decision caught British officials completely off guard. They had assumed that American assistance would continue during the Reconstruction period. The British economy had been operating with 55% of its output dedicated to war production. Factories needed time to convert back to civilian manufacturing. Britain was importing half its food supply using Lend-Lease dollars. And without those dollars, the country faced genuine food shortages. John Maynard Keynes, the most respected economist of his generation, calculated that Britain was heading toward what he called a financial Dunkirk. The country would run out of foreign currency within months, forcing it to default on international payments and potentially ration food down to starvation levels. There was only one option available. Britain would have to request a loan from the United States. In September 1945, Keynes traveled to Washington to negotiate. He was 62 years old and suffering from the heart disease that would kill him within months. He believed Britain had a strong moral case. The country had fought alone against Hitler for 2 years while America remained neutral. Surely that sacrifice deserved recognition. The American negotiators saw things differently. They offered a loan of $3.75 billion at 2% interest with strict conditions attached. The most damaging requirement was that Britain make the pound sterling fully convertible within 1 year of receiving the funds. Keynes understood this provision would prove catastrophic, but the alternative was national bankruptcy. The agreement was signed in December 1945. Keynes died 4 months later. The convertibility trap on July 15, 1947. Britain fulfilled the loan requirement and made the pound sterling convertible. Any holder of British currency could now exchange it for American dollars at the Bank of England. The result was immediate and devastating. Countries that had accumulated sterling during the war years rushed to convert their holdings into dollars. American goods were superior and more readily available, so everyone wanted the currency that could purchase them. Within 5 weeks, nearly $1 billion drained from British reserves. On August 20, 1947, Britain was forced to suspend convertibility in humiliation. The country had burned through a quarter of its American loan in just over a month, and had nothing to show for it except a currency crisis that demonstrated British weakness to the entire world. 2 years later, the damage continued. Britain devalued the pound from $4.03 to $2.80. Overnight, everything British citizens owned became 30% less valuable relative to the rest of the world. That same month, Britain informed Washington it could no longer afford to maintain its military commitments in Greece and Turkey. The Truman Doctrine followed. With America stepping into the role Britain could no longer sustain. The final reckoning. The last payment on Britain's post-war loan arrived at the U.S. Treasury on December 29, 2006. 61 years of checks, stretching across the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and into the 21st century. The beneficiaries of this arrangement were clear. American investment banks collected millions in fees from the forced asset sales. American corporations acquired British-owned companies at half their actual value. Defense contractors received billions in government orders that were ultimately billed to London, and the United States Treasury accumulated 2/3 of the world's gold reserves by 1945. The British Empire was not defeated by Germany. It was purchased by its closest ally, one asset at a time, under terms negotiated while bombs fell on London. The dollar replaced the pound as the world's reserve currency. American military bases spread across territories that had flown the Union Jack for centuries. Britain won the war and lost its empire. The special relationship delivered victory and bankruptcy in equal measure, and the methods employed during those desperate years did not disappear when peace returned. They became the template for how economic power would be exercised for generations to come.